If you've ever been in an Eastern Orthodox church, either in the United States or elsewhere, you'll notice that one of the big differences, at least as far as walking into the church, between a typical Protestant church and an Eastern Orthodox church, is that in the Eastern Orthodox church there are a lot of icons or flat representations of saints and important events in the history of the Christian church. There's a lot more artwork on the walls, and they use more things in their services for part of their liturgy. Things are very regular and artistic. Whether it's a Greek Orthodox church or a Russian Orthodox church. That seems to be one of the things that we first notice. It's interesting when you think about religious freedom for the Greek Orthodox during the modern era in the Ottoman Empire, and also the Russian Orthodox during the modern era of Russia. They have two slightly different stories as far as how much religious freedom they had. If we go back in the history of Greek Orthodoxy, of course, the Roman Catholic on the west side and the Greek Orthodox on the east side split with each other as the Roman Empire split. The two sides took two different sides of theological issues, cultural stances, their political circumstances were different, and they began to grow apart. They finally separated in the year 1054 when the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church and the Patriarch of Constantinople mutually excommunicated one another. Now, Rome was never on good terms with the Greek Orthodox that were centered in Constantinople and vice versa. The two tried at reconciling every once in a while, but I'll tell you something. During the Fourth Crusade in 1202 to 1204, when the Roman Catholic Crusaders came in and took over Constantinople, that was the final straw. As if the schism wasn't bad enough already by this mutual excommunication, the two just completely divorced each other, for lack of better terms. Eventually, in the year 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. It's a very difficult city to overtake militarily, but they were able to do it, so they moved in as the Muslim push to the west came further across what used to be the Eastern Roman Empire. So in the year 1453, the Turks took over, and they looked at the church as it was. They didn't want to totally disband it. But they looked at Christians as if they were all one ethnic group, regardless of what countries they were in. They said, oh, those Christians. Well, they treated them like their own race, so to speak. And they let Christians lead Christians. So they elected people to put into place, still under Muslim rule, but Christian patriarchs and Christian bishops were allowed to rule over groups of Christians within certain areas under the larger caliphate, or the caliph's authority in the various Muslim lands. So the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox in particular, continued to grow a little bit in the Ottoman Empire, but there was always that the mother government, so to speak, the Ottoman Turks that were right behind them. If it was ever sensed that the Christians or the churches in general were competing for authority with the political machine, well, they were suppressed. But generally speaking, they were allowed to have enough religious freedom to rule themselves. Even the Patriarch had civil authority over Christians and was able to make taxation decisions for people in the Ottoman Empire as it continued to spread. In 1453, when the Eastern Roman Empire, what was called the Byzantine Roman Empire, fell, there had been some growth in the Russian Church up until that time in the southern regions. You see, the Eastern Orthodox missionaries went northward into Russia and began establishing churches as early as the 10th century. The Russian Orthodox Church had its own patriarch eventually and separated itself. It saw Rome as falling in the 5th century, Constantinople as falling in the 15th century, and so in Moscow they kind of set up what they called a third Rome. It was a very pro-Russian church. Yes, they were Eastern Orthodox, but they began separating themselves from the Greek Orthodox. From the period of 1453, when the Turks came in and knocked off Constantinople, all the way up until 1589, when the Russian Patriarch was established, we find during that time the policies were very pro-Russian, very nationalistic, and if it was even sensed that Christians were kind of fighting against the state at all or being too friendly with outside countries, they were generally suppressed. So that was a matter of Christian freedom as well. If you got along well with the state, you were allowed to continue. If you didn't, then you would face some degree of persecution. This all continued, don't have any international influences as far as the church was concerned. That campaign continued until the time of Peter the Great. At the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, Peter started looking toward the West to reform Russia in general, but also as far as religion was concerned. He opened himself up to the industrialization and other ways of the Western culture and brought those ideas into Russia. So now it wasn't just a matter of being pro-Russian, it was a matter of being progressive and trying to grow Russia in a variety of ways. With Peter the Great, people in the Russian Orthodox Church started interacting with Protestants and also with Catholics, which was original. Usually they had just interacted at best with some of the Greek Orthodox theologians and shared in their conversations. But now Russian Orthodox Christians were interacting with Catholics and were interacting with Protestants as well. So this continued. Peter the Great, by the way, he said, no more patriarch, no more monarchy. We're going to kind of diversify authority within the church. And so in 1700, when the Patriarchate of Moscow was abandoned, he didn't elect a new patriarch right away. He waited until about 1720, 1721, and then he finally established a synod that ruled. It was basically a group of 10 people that kind of ruled like an oligarchy form of government for the church for 2 centuries. That takes us all the way up until the 20th century. We shift back into the Ottoman Empire, and there's a tremendous amount of persecution against Christians, against the Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christians as well. As a matter of fact, from 1894 up until 1923 or so, it's estimated that about 3.5 million Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christians were massacred, sometimes being imprisoned and left to die naturally, sometimes just being slaughtered in their homes, but 3.5 million during that era. And so at the end of the Ottoman Empire, we see this very intense persecution against Christianity, and the church, of course, had to react and adapt to that situation. In Russia, with the Russian Revolution, between 1917, during the era of Lenin, up through 1921, and in the years following up to World War II, Christianity was seen as an enemy of the state. Karl Marx and his philosophy of politics had no room for the church, and so therefore the church was just really totally suppressed during that era. However, when Joseph Stalin was trying to get up interest in the country in general and funds and everything to go to war against the Germans in World War II, he decided to reopen the churches that the communist state had closed before. So he allowed people to, the priests that were put in concentration camps, for example, he freed them and allowed them to come back and raise funds for the war effort. And so the Russian Orthodox Church began to revive itself, but it also supported Stalin and his efforts in the war. However, for those of you who are students of Russian history, you know that after World War II, the church was pretty much controlled tightly, as was everything, by the state in Russia during the 20th century. The church wasn't really allowed to grow. It was allowed to function within the guidance of the state, but for the most part was suppressed as far as growth was concerned, all the way up until the fall of communism in the 1980s. So again, we ask the question, as far as religious freedom is concerned and the survival of Christianity during these times of intense persecution in the Ottoman Empire and also in Russia in its various fluctuations in politics, what was it that caused the Eastern Orthodox, Russian or Greek, to continue to survive? If you ask students of Eastern Orthodox history today, they'll tell you that there were 2 things that seemed to cause them to continue and exercise their religious freedom. One of them was simply the icons and the art. The other was the liturgy. In other words, the regular practices and habits and the artwork also of the Greek Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, even in the severest times of persecution, those things weren't regarded by the state as being harmful. They continued to sing the same hymns, to recite the same poems, to have the same artwork, to have the same pictures up, and to go through the same motions with the censers and the incense and all of the picturesque imagery that happens during an Eastern Orthodox worship service. It was through these rituals that the theology and the life and the history of the Eastern Orthodox Church was preserved, even during times of intense persecution. So during the Ottoman occupation, during the Russian fluctuations in politics, the Eastern Orthodox Church continued to survive, but it preserved its history and its theology through things that seemed so mundane, like just ritualistic habits that they did on a regular basis. That's all for now. We'll see you next time. God bless you.